Hello, friends. This is our next podcast that gets us started on our new unit, obviously, about taxonomy and classification. So let's see what that exactly is about. First of all, there's a lot of life on Earth, and scientists have always tried to catalog it, classify it, divide it into groups. Why? Well, precisely because there's so much life on Earth. Depending on whose textbook you read, there's anywhere between 3 million and 20 million species on Earth, and we really just don't know. At any rate, it is a lot of species on the planet. Less than 2 million of these have actually been identified and named by people, so there's still a lot out there waiting to be discovered. Most of these unknown species are in the rainforest, but also the oceans. We barely tap the surface of the oceans. And there's, of course, an incredible amount of diversity among all that life. And if we want to study it and understand it, finding a way to organize it, to make the organisms easier to identify and their relationships to each other easier to understand is what we have to do. So, classification versus taxonomy. Those two things are often talked about together. They are not exactly the same thing. Classification is grouping organisms based on how similar they are, whereas taxonomy is the branch of biology where we name those organisms and group them according to their evolutionary relationship. So obviously these are closely related, but classification is something we do within taxonomy. Okay? So, how did we get started doing this? Who was the first? Well, you can imagine it goes back to the Greeks, Aristotle again, who had ideas about evolution as well. He was the first to classify living things. He put living things into two major groups, plants and animals. And within those groups, he did something different than what we do today. He organized them based on where they lived. Were they in the air? Were they in the sea? Were they on land? And that just really did not work very well for obvious reasons. Some live on both places. It certainly does not show the actual relatedness of organisms to each other. So that was just not a good idea. But at least he was the first to try to organize all this stuff in a way to make it manageable and understandable. The guy who did the most for taxonomy and whose system we are still using today, amazingly enough, is Linnaeus. Carolus Linnaeus. He lived in the 1700s. As you can see, from 1707 to 1778. And he based the classification not on where organisms live, but on their actual physical attributes, their physical characteristics. And he also came up with the naming system that we still use today called binomial nomenclature. So two-name naming system. Two words give the species its name. The first word in the name is the genus. I don't know if you remember your classification levels. We'll be talking about those soon. But your genus, which is the name of a group of closely related species, and then a second descriptive word. For example, Homo sapiens is, of course, the name for humans. Homo is the genus name. Sapiens is the word meaning wise man. We'll see if that's really true. But anyway, Canis familiaris is the name for, you know what, the domestic dog. So now, all of Linnaeus's stuff, even his own name, he Latinized, and he used Latin as the language of classification, of taxonomy. Why? Why Latin? Please don't tell Ms. Wagstaff I said so, but it is commonly considered a dead language. Of course, it's not dead. It lives on in many of our other languages today, but people don't speak Latin per se anymore, so it never changes. It is those words can be used, and trust that we're not going to change them, alter their meanings. So it's very consistent. And that's why Linnaeus chose it and why we still use it today. It is a consistent language. Now, there are various characteristics used by taxonomists to classify organisms and group them, okay? Of course, obviously, we look at their external and even their internal structures, their anatomy. That anatomy is just the body parts of living things. We look at their chemical makeup, and what I mean by that is their DNA and their proteins, because proteins are based on your DNA. And this is probably the best way to classify things now, because by looking at an organism's DNA, you can easily see who shares the most DNA in common, the A's, the T's, the C's, and G's. And it's a very straightforward way of determining relationships, okay? We classify based on those evolutionary relationships. We want our classification, our taxonomy, to reflect the true relatedness of different groups of animals and plants. So that's what we use to classify. So how does it work? Our classification system works by this method. Organisms are grouped into categories. These categories are called taxa. Okay? A single category is a taxon. Taxon. Okay, that's singular. The taxa are kingdom. That's the largest group. It is the most inclusive group. And it is also the most general. The greatest number of organisms can fit under the level of a of kingdom. Next would be phylum, then class, then smaller still is order, then family, then genus, and then, of course, last is the one individual species. That is the smallest and most specific taxonomic group, okay? Now, the names of organisms and the way we classify them into these groups hopefully show evolutionary relationships, okay? Let's look at this, for example. A bobcat is known as Lynx rufus. That is its genus and species name, Lynx rufus. There is also a cat called Lynx canadensis, okay? These are the bobcat and the lynx. They are two different cats, but you can see they are really closely related because they share the same genus, even though they are different species, okay? They don't interbreed. So when we are thinking about the lynx and the bobcat, what we find is, and I didn't mention this earlier, but there is a level even higher than kingdom called domain. There's only 3 domains. There's currently about 6 kingdoms, though that number's probably getting bigger. So the bobcat and the lynx share their domain, the kingdom, the phylum is Chordata, the class is Mammalia, they're both mammals, the order is Carnivora, family Felidae, the cat family, feline, and the bobcat and the lynx share the genus. This is the classification for this animal, a panther, and they obviously diverge from the panther here. But so that much is all the same. So kingdom, animal, phylum, Chordata, class, Mammalia, carnivore, Felidae, and lynx is all the same, okay? So how do we determine the relationships, that they are similar, they are not? We obviously compare their physical characteristics, but another place we start is with fossil history, because we are trying to go back in time and classify not only the relationships of the living things we see today, but their ancestors that lived before them. So we compare the structures of modern organisms to those of fossils. We also use development, which we talked about when we talked about evolution as well. The embryonic forms of species can often show relationships that we don't see in the adults. An adult fish and an adult human look really different, but if we go back at the embryonic level, they look really similar. And we can see the similarities that we don't often find in the adult forms contained back in the embryos, and kind of reveal some common relationships from that. Biochemistry, I already mentioned this is probably the best way to determine relationships because we just look at the gene sequences, the nucleotide sequences, how many A's, T's, C's, and G's are the same. So this is arguably the best way to determine relationships because it's objective and it's quantitative. You literally count the A's, C's, and T's, and G's and see how they match up in the genetic code. But we could even use behaviors to determine relationships. Mating calls and other behaviors lead to organisms being isolated into species because they use those mating calls to reproduce and so on. And so they can even be used to identify species and relationships. So the goal of all this classification and taxonomy is to create a phylogeny, a family tree that shows the evolutionary history of a species, its relationship to other species. For example, what we are seeing in this phylogenetic tree, this phylogeny, is that the panther here, or leopard, my bad, genus Panthera, the skunk here, the otter here, the domestic dog, and the wolf here are all related to each other by a common ancestor. The common ancestor is represented by the branching point in the family tree, some ancient organism that had fur, that provided milk to its young, and so on. Had descendants that went on different evolutionary paths and led up to the cat family here, the skunk and otter family here, and the dog family in this branch. And what we can see by this is that the skunk and the otter share a more recent common ancestor than all of these families do. Their common ancestors way back here. And the dog and the wolf share a more recent common ancestor than this otter and skunk do. We can see that by the placement of where that branching point is. So that's kind of how you look at a phylogeny, and that's what we're trying to create when we group organisms. Here's another phylogeny. This is actually called a cladogram, the way it's made. But what we can see, again, is that all of these organisms, the turtle, the horse, the wolf, the leopard, the cat, are all related by a common ancestor that's represented here at this branching point. Some ancient group gave rise to all of these, okay? But the leopard and the cat obviously share a more recent common ancestor than either of them has with the wolf or with the horse, and so on. So that's how you read a cladogram. Now, our kingdom system is 6 kingdoms, okay? They are the kingdom of the true bacteria. These are the bacteria we bump into on a daily basis, whether we want to or not. The ancient bacteria called archaebacteria, we don't bump into these kinds so much, though they still exist. Protista, we'll talk about them. Fungus, plants, and animals. Those are our 6 kingdoms. These 6 kingdoms have been further arranged into 3 larger domains. The bacteria and the archaebacteria, shown here and here, have their own domains separate to themselves. All of these are eukaryotic organisms, and they all have their very own domain. Okay, they are all placed together with all the eukaryotes and domain eukarya. But we can see that the kingdoms are here, 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 and there. Used to be a 5-kingdom system where we threw all bacteria into one kingdom called Monera, but that's not true anymore because we found that these 2 groups of bacteria are so different that they can't even be put in the same kingdom together, which is kind of amazing because, you know, bacteria all look the same to me, but there's some really fundamental differences about them. So how do we determine what goes into what kingdom? Those kingdoms are determined by the characteristics of the cells. Do they have a cell wall? Do they have a nucleus? Things like that. and how they obtain food. Are they autotrophic? Are they heterotrophic? Those kinds of things. That's how we fundamentally arrange into those fundamental kingdoms. Okay? What we see here is that this was the original 5-kingdom system up top. We don't have that anymore. Monera has been split into 2. This is our 3-domain system, which splits these guys and then includes all of these into this large domain category. But what I really wanted to show you was that we are probably going to get lots and lots more kingdoms. We have these 6 now, but they are busy splitting up the Protista kingdom into probably 6 or 7 more kingdoms and so on. So for our purposes, we're not going to worry about that. We're going to talk about Protistans altogether. But the point is that this taxonomy system is always in a state of flux because scientists are still trying to figure it all out. There's a lot that's not known. So what may be classified as an animal today might be something else tomorrow. So just, as we find out more and more about how related they are. Okay. All right. That's it. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next podcast. Take care.